Welcome back to the Demystify Sci podcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And today we are talking origin of life with Michael Lachmann, who is a professor from the Santa Fe Institute and came to our attention because one of our patrons, I think Dan, sent me his paper on the origins of evolution. And this really spiked my interest because I've heard tons of people talking about the origin of life. How did it begin on Earth? Was it panspermia? Was it some kind of process that happened deep inside of the Earth? Warm little pond on the surface. We've talked to people like Nick Lane and Bruce Damer and James Tour. James Tour famously is of the opinion that the origin of life cannot possibly be explained.
Lee Cronin
as well, who's focused on astrobiology and trying to figure out sensors for life. But nobody had really talked about the idea of evolution emerging as some kind of selection process. And
prior to life.
Or
in the absence of life.
Yeah, exactly. And so Professor Lachmann is here to talk to us about what it actually means to conceive of life as this process that has a certain shape to it and a certain arc to it. And I think Shiloh's going to be upset because I say shape, even though it's definitely something that only has an abstract shape.
There's a relational context window for sure, like in the Wolfram sense. Yeah.
And for Lachmann, life is about information. It's about figuring out how to narrow the window of probabilities into something that is more narrow and more functional. And so we talk about how seeing life through the lens of information is important, what it lets you do. We talk about human culture. We talk about what is the point of studying the origin of life? Because this is something that Shiloh and I come up against fairly often, which is that, okay, is this a similar question to cosmology? Are we just trying to figure out an impossible question about the origin of the universe that is so lost to time and space that it's like counting angels on the head of a pin? And I think in this conversation, we come down to the idea that there's a deep relationship between understanding the origin of life, understanding the differentiation between the process of life and the characteristic of alive, and all of the features of nature that emerge around those two things, that lets us think more carefully about the environments that we live in, the groups that we embody.
The future that we're steaming towards. And also like big questions like, should biologists take a crack at astronomy?
Mm-hmm.
What is life? What is alive? These are really, really important questions for our entire epistemological, ontological structure that we hold so sacred in our scientific approach to reality, which seems to be the popular one today as opposed to a mythological one of the past. And there's questions about that, which we get into in the back half as well. Are we reinventing the wheel in a numeric scientific sense? Let's find out.
If you like what we do, as always, consider supporting the podcast. We run a Patreon where we meet with our patrons every single week. You can join it for, I think, as little as $3 a month. And it sounds very cliche to say, but every little bit really does help. We want to be able to run this project without advertisements, without sponsors. And the only way that we can do that is if you guys who listen to the show and who love it help us by supporting it. So come on over to patreon.com/demystifysci. We've also got a bunch of other things.
Yeah, if you can't do that, that's fine. Maybe we'll be able to in the future, but you could tell someone about the show, especially if you find an episode that you think they'll really relate to. Just share it. Tell people about it. You can also come over to one of our chat platforms, come over to Discord, come over to Facebook. Tell us your thoughts. Tell us what we could do better. Tell us who you'd like to see on the show. Of course, give us a subscription. Give us a like. These things matter. They help us reach more and more people. And that's a huge help, and it costs you nothing. It means everything to us. So thank you for tuning in, and thank you for supporting the podcast in whatever way you're able to do that.
And for now, enjoy the conversation with Michael Lachmann, and we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
If you go to some area in the universe or anywhere, and then you ask, can life emerge here, or will life emerge here? What are the conditions under which something like life can emerge. That's a question that it's almost a fundamental question that I'm interested in, and I don't have a very good approach to. So my work in evolution is I work a lot around the idea of information. How does information emerge in evolution, and how is it used? And then in terms of origin of life, I have the approach where I claim that the processes of selection, as they happen in evolution, happen in every physical system all the time. So they happen in the sun, they happen in a glass of water. Just the process of selection, that some things that you have a variation of things that exist, and some survive and some don't. That's the basic process of evolution. They create information in every system, just as they create in biological systems. So I'm saying that selection processes create information in every system, but then the question is, in which type of systems will life emerge, right? If selection generates this information in every system, which of them will then have life emerging? And that is one that I don't have a good approach to.
And I know that we asked this question when we were having our pre-show meeting, but do you have a definition for life that you like to use?
Yes, I played around with various definitions. One was a big pile of functional information. So I think that when we look at anything around us, even a car, we recognize a lot of functional things in it. When we look at an ant, when we look at a leaf. And that functional information was generated by the evolutionary process. So that was one of the definitions, which is like a big enough pile of functional information. These days, I work with a slightly different definition, though related, and I think of life as the system that generated all this functional information. So on Earth, we had an evolutionary system, and that evolutionary system created all this pile of functional information that we see around us in life. And so for me, the definition of life is the system that enables the emergence and collection of functional information to an almost infinite amount.
Is there something specific about life that makes it obsessed with information, or is it the obsession with information causes life to emerge?
I think to some degree, life, as I said at the beginning, life is a big enough pile of functional information. So I think that function and life are very tightly linked.
So it's basically an emergent property that we use. So
what does function mean?
And functional. Okay. All right. Let's do
functional.
it. Yeah. What does functional mean, and what is information?
So information is, or at least the information that I'm interested in, is much easier to define. So information is a reduction in uncertainty. So if, for example, the example that I always play with is like someone threw a die and there's 6 possible outcomes, and then they tell you, oh, it was actually odd. The number is an odd number. So then the number of possibilities was reduced from 6 to 3. and that reduction is information. So a reduction in uncertainty is information. In this case, it was the reduction from 6 equally likely possibilities to 3 is a twofold reduction, and that means 1 bit of information. So information is reduction of uncertainty. And
that's
functional-
really interesting,
Uh-huh.
because that suggests that the probabilistic nature of existence is the background, and then anything that's able to winnow down the full potential of what could happen is able to get some kind of information. Like, that's a very straightforward understanding, right? Because
Get some information or provide some information.
either one, right? Because in this example, you have somebody who is saying that, you know, you roll a dice and they're like, it's even. Okay, well, that's somebody's providing information and somebody's gotten the information because presumably somebody's received it. But the idea is that you have a vast quantity of things that could be happening. It's the full complement, the full set of occurrences. And then somebody is giving you a narrower domain in which to think, and that is information. It's basically being able to see some path that is carved out in this entire roiling water of what could be, to say that, okay, it's not everything. It's this subset. Let's focus on that and see what we can do with it. Is that a fair assessment?
Right. I mean, it doesn't have to be everything absolutely possible. You know, it can be. I mean, it usually will be a small amount of uncertainty that is then reduced. Like, what's the temperature tomorrow? Well, I have some idea of what it could be, and then I look at the weather report, and then that uncertainty is reduced. So it's so in this definition of information, you need to have some kind of quantification of the uncertainty that you talk about, all the possibilities. And this is Shannon. This is the Shannon's definition of information. Or oh, sorry, what is this? Oh, I know what this is.
So it's a perspective then. So like it requires that you have some perspective, right? Like you have some sense of how uncertain something is, and then when that uncertainty is narrowed by some new perception, then you have information.
Right. Yeah. But notice that this is very different from, or I mean, it's slightly related, but different from, I read a book and I gain some information from the book. So usually that type of information is really different, because it's not that I had some underlying distribution of what the universe is, and then reading the book reduced that uncertainty. That type of information is different. So it's a very narrow definition of what information is, and it is it's also tightly linked to entropy and thermodynamics. So in thermodynamics, you talk about entropy is this something very similar, the distribution of states that the system could be in, and then you can reduce this by say doing work, or you could do work by increasing the number of these states. So that's where this connection between information and work is. In a way, when I tell you something and I reduce the number of possibilities that you have, I must have done some work.
And so you've done this work. You have changed the landscape of possibilities. What part of this makes it functional or dysfunctional? Because that was the other thing that Shiloh wanted to know.
Right. So functional, that's much harder to define, and especially like functional information. And this gets closer to this right, reading the book, I gain functional information, right? It's not this type of Shannon information. So functional, the simplest definition is simply let's say I have a system in which, so let's talk about an evolutionary system. So I have a system in which there's a distribution of entities or distribution of organisms, and then some survive and some don't. And the in this reduction, if the reason that they didn't survive was some functional difference between them, then the population and individuals kind of gained functional information about how to survive. So it is so functional information is a feature that allows the organism or the entity to survive.
So the function is survival in this case. So it's like
Yes.
survival information.
And that makes sense to be linked directly to life, because if a bundle of information arises and is in the environment somewhere, which, can we say that information can be in the environment in some kind of patterned state? Like, is it crystal information?
Well, it sounds like the entire definition of information is based on perception to begin with. So, I mean, in order to have perception, you have to be alive, right? It seems like a bit circular.
Ooh.
Do you see what I'm saying? Like, if your definition of information is about being able to perceive uncertainty or degrees of uncertainty in some possibility space, then you have to be alive in order to perceive uncertainty. So wouldn't perception be a more appropriate definition of life?
I don't think so, but I have to exactly see why not. So
Let me ask you this. Is information possible without something to perceive it?
information, for information, you have some kind of way to transmit the information. So I mean, you can talk about something simple as even though here this is not a very good answer to your question, but let's say we have a thermostat, right? So the thermostat currently doesn't know or hasn't measured yet the temperature of the room, and then by measuring the temperature, now the uncertainty of the thermostat in terms of what the temperature in the room is reduced, and then the thermostat either turns on or doesn't turn on the air conditioning. So, I mean, we have many systems that can do this, not just thermostat, but systems that measure something in the environment and then react to it. I wouldn't say that they are alive because of this, even though I think that, of course, thermostats don't arise on their own. So they arose in our origin of life. Thermostats arose. So in that sense, they are part of life. So I think one can also say that I think that talking about information in that sense doesn't make sense when you don't have life. But I think that okay, let's look at, just so that we have an example, right? So I claim that you can have a functional information emerging in a system, in a physical system. Let's take an example, physical system. So one place where I think one nice system that I think is nice to play with in these terms is like a solar system that just emerged. So we have the solar system, and we have like asteroids and planets going all around. And now I think there's a process like this. So each of these asteroids or planets has some kind of orbit. I think that if the orbit is more circular, then that planet has less chance to interact with others. The more eccentric the orbit is, the more likely it is to hit others. So what happens is that then there is a selection where planets or pieces of rock that have more eccentric orbits will hit others and thus will be thrown into a different orbit or will be destroyed.
Less likely to
So in
survive.
the early,
Less functional.
yeah, exactly. Less exactly. So and I think this causes a selection process where more and more round orbits are selected. Of course, there can be also other processes that will cause the orbits to be more round, not selective orbits, but I think selective processes. But I think one of the processes that causes the emergence of rounder orbits is this selection process.
But now, is this functional selection not at a sufficient threshold to be considered life at that point? Is it a threshold?
I wouldn't. Yeah, I wouldn't consider it life. So what I think I would say here is that the selection process transferred functional information into the distribution of the planets. Now, each planet has a bit of information about how to not hit other planets, in the sense that its orbit is rounder. But I don't think that the system crossed the threshold of life. So it collected functional information, but what I said before is that life is a sufficiently large pile of functional information, so it's not sufficiently large yet. And the system hasn't yet learned to collect a lot of information. So each of these planets maybe has probably less than one bit of information about how not to hit others. In order to have life, eventually something like a genome has to emerge, some kind of reproduction system, and so on. And then with these, you can collect more information. So I think that functional information can be transferred into the system without having life. But later, it makes more sense to talk about it as information.
Well, a large enough pile of functional information also implies a sufficient diversity of information, because you might have a lot of information about how to not hit other planets in orbit.
There might be more other important things besides hitting planets too, right? Like you can imagine other selective pressures on the formation of these planets, that they weren't too close to the star, that there wasn't another star that was sufficiently close by to yank them out of their orbits, that they weren't comprised of volatile atoms that would, dissipate too quickly. Like, I almost feel like it's just a matter of how long I sit down and think about it for how big of a list of functional information I could prepare for you regarding the survivability of a planet. Like, I feel like this is just a sort of...
So you're suggesting that there is a near infinite pile of functional information necessary in order to ensure that a planet actually becomes a planet.
Like me and a really, really good chatbot could probably come up with an unending list of functional information for the survivability of a planet.
That's probably true. And there's also the other additional problem, which is that if a planet survives for long enough in a good enough position, we assume that it would eventually sprout life on it, and then that life would develop far enough to be able to then go to a different planet. And so at some point we're having to draw these arbitrary lines between the planet itself and the life that the planet begets, and then say that here it is not life or alive, but at some point it transforms into life that is alive. And yet we don't totally know where that line is, and yet we know that there must be that line somewhere.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with the threshold. I just want to understand it. We talked to Lee Cronin about this a bit with the threshold of complexity in molecules and so forth. And, he defines it, at least. He draws that line in the sand. I'm just curious what that line is for you.
Okay, you talked about way too many things in this 1 minute. Let's wait. I want to go back a bit. So first of all, about all these properties, like, so you're right? So at the same time, you can select on many things for a planet. So one is, wait,
Many pressures for the survivability, perhaps.
my cat tries to come in. Okay, all of these happen at the same time. Also, you can have selection pressures that go in opposite direction. So you can at the same time select for a round orbit and for an eccentric orbit. That can also happen. One important feature for each one of these properties is how long is it maintained. So orbit actually is a really good property for selection because basically the planet will almost have it forever. So it is maintained for a really long time. Whereas another example that I like to play with is like a cup of coffee and you disturb it with your finger, and now that you created all these waves, and there's like a, I don't know, like a Mickey Mouse shaped waves and a flat waves and various waves like this. And these waves each has a slightly different survival rate. The one that is shaped like a Mickey Mouse probably dissipates immediately, whereas the more rounder waves, they survive for longer. But waves don't, I mean, overall, these properties, they all dissipate very quickly. So now they're already gone. So that's another thing, like how long does it take? You introduce functional information into the system, but then a lot of it doesn't survive long and is dissipated very quickly. So that's another. So because you were talking about this infinite list of things that you could select on, some of them don't survive for long enough to maintain this functional information. Another issue, and this is something really cool, is this. This is I hope it won't be too big of a jump. But basically, in order to create this functional information, you have to have, like I said before, you need to do work on the system. The system needs to have this thing called free energy. And this free energy, when it dissipates, it creates this functional information. So the solar system, as it forms, it dissipates free energy. And that's what allows for this selection. The cool thing is that the amount of free energy that is dissipated in a certain time is limited. There is a certain amount, like this many joules. And that amount of energy that is dissipated limits how much free energy, how much functional information you could generate. So there's this infinite list of features that you talked about, but there is this one fundamental limit where you can say, all of the information and all of them together, this whole infinite list, couldn't amount to more than the amount of free energy that was dissipated. So there is kind of a fundamental limit to how much free energy, how much functional information is generated or could be generated. So that shows that it's not a totally arbitrary list. It's not that you can sit down and just come up with an infinite number of things that were selected at the same time. The total amount of them is limited.
I feel like if you're selecting for a stable planetary orbit, that's the criteria for what is functional, then it's not necessarily an energetic balance as to how many factors could feed into that. Like whether or not, there's an unending nest of circumstances that could result in that not being a stable orbit. I guess the bigger question is, what is the threshold of that functional information? How big of a pile do you need in order to consider it life? Because I'm really interested in the narrowness of our definition of life. And I'm really interested in why we seem to, have chosen to arbitrarily restrict it to organisms on Earth and not looked at celestial phenomenon through a biological lens.
Yeah. Okay. So even though we jumped over one question that you raised, but let's go on to this threshold. So, and this is also linked to Lee's work. So when Lee says that you need, like the threshold is 15, above assembly index, above assembly of 15 is where
So like a certain
is.
size of molecule, something like that, a certain complexity.
Yeah, a molecule that needs 15 steps to make. If you find enough copies of such a molecule, and it doesn't have to be exactly 15, maybe 16, then you detected life. But it's life detection. It's not a definition of life. So what Lee is saying is, when there is a molecule that needs 15 steps to be made, then someone needs to remember how these 15 steps, they're written somewhere. So that means that you have already some kind of genome that can at least remember 15 steps. And you have to have enough evolution happening that selected these 15 steps and not other 15 steps. So it's not that Lee says this 15-step molecule is life or alive or something like this. It's just a detector that you have a genome and you have selection happening, and that's where the threshold is. So the threshold is, there's many thresholds, but one that you could put in where you say, if you have a genome, that's one threshold. So that a genome will enable a much more complex life to emerge than without a genome. And of course, I think that the genome emerged relatively late in evolution. So the genome is also a very sophisticated machinery that needed to evolve. And so you got to this 15-step threshold way before you had the genome like we know it. And I suspect also way before you had something like, say, RNA. So in order to have a genome, you have to have a previous genome that can remember how to make this genome. And so I think so that is another threshold. Another threshold is being able to supply energy. So free energy is what enables the system to continue to select functional information. And in the system, the planetary system, that free energy is, I think it's supplied with the gravitational collapse of the cloud, is limited. It's not that the planet can regenerate it all the time. So the planets in orbit didn't pass the threshold of being able to get some free energy from some other system and continually process it to eat something, right? Or to use the sun's light in order to continue to select and being more and more in a better and better orbit. The planets don't have a system like this. So there's these other thresholds that you need to pass.
The planets do probably get some influence from their gravitational environment and from the electromagnetic environment and from all of these periodic interactions periodic and cyclic interactions that they have with their companions. And so there is some input that goes into it, but it doesn't pass the threshold of being able to create enough raw motive power to continue along the path that it was already on, right? So I can imagine a condition where we're like, the planet is not alive in the conventional sense, because the way that we view aliveness and life is that life tends to make something that looks like more of itself. And so when we talk about Lee Cronin's definition, which is the production of complexity in abundance, we're talking about life as this master machinist. And from an astrobiological sense, okay, so you can detect these large quantities of complex molecules and you have a sensor for being able to say that there's life on this planet. And to go back to Shiloh's point, you can also detect that, okay, perhaps planets have gone through some kind of functional selection where there is a process by which they have winnowed down their orbits in order to end up in a place.
Survive.
But it's hard to say that there isn't some kind of regime change in the life of the planet after it establishes itself somewhere and then just stabilizes. And then other things start to happen upon it, which are very different in scale. Because it's not like you're having planetary scale phenomena happening on the planet, which then leads to the increase of planetary complexity. What you end up having is that an environment is formed, the environment becomes stable, and then in the crash of that stable place, you can have a different scale of process that begins.
Or maybe.
And scales upwards. Well, I mean, I suppose, yeah, you can do panspermia and you can do everything else. But I guess it lends itself to thinking about things in different scales. And science, after all, is the process of being able to say that we place an arbitrary bin. You go to an apple tree in flower and you ask how many apples are on this tree. And it's like, okay, well, where does the apple begin? Do you have to figure out which of the blossoms have been fertilized? Is the blossom that is fertilized that has just sprouted the very beginning of the apple already an apple? Is it only the ones that are ripe? Is it only the ones that have fallen off on the ground? Like, we have to place some bin for being able to handle these things. But the bin that we place is almost always utilitarian. Therefore, the question is, what does this let us do? If we perceive life as being this bundle of functional information, sufficiently large, what does that give us? What does that let us do? Why bin it that way?
I think that it actually so seeing life, so in a way it is right. So the claim is to see life in some sense as a continuum. From a cup of water that you stir all the way to the system that we have here, it's some kind of continuum where we can place arbitrary or less arbitrary thresholds. So we say you have a genome, you need to have a genome, you need to be able to supply yourself with energy, you need to have cells, I don't know, and so on. Maybe you need to have something that is alive. So it allows us to do actually a lot. So, for example, one question that I really like to ask is this. So we know that life emerged on Earth maybe 4 billion years ago. What happened since then? Why doesn't life emerge now outside there on the ground? Is it that there were processes on Earth 4 billion years ago that allowed the emergence of life, and they never happened since then on Earth? Or could it be that these processes like this happen all the time? And now, if they happen all the time, then how far do they get? So Darwin's quote about imagine a little pool of water, or I forgot what.
A warm little pool.
Yeah, warm little pool was actually an answer to this question. So he said that the reason that he thinks life doesn't emerge again and again is because life needs resources. It's a bit. One of them is this free energy, but life needs resources. And what happens is, if you have now a warm little pool, then existing life will use up these resources, and that's why life can't emerge again. So that was his answer. But
it just can't compete, basically. The proto life forms can't compete with the extant life forms.
I think that they can't it's not exactly, maybe they can't compete. It's not that they can't compete. They can't, their resources are taken from them, so they can't emerge because the resources are gone in a way, which is one type of competition, is where you resources are taken away from you.
I would imagine that the emergence of life needs a lot of calm time where there's not a lot happening that's active, that's moving faster than you. Right? I would
Yeah, but
imagine
there is,
oh, go ahead.
there's a timescale question, right? So what, sorry. You need to say what the timescale is. Like, what is a lot of time? So maybe for molecular interactions, a lot of time is 1 second, or a million years. So something in the selection process and the survival rate of the entities will set some kind of time scale, in which then you're right. You need enough time things need to not dissipate very quickly so that the information can be maintained. And then you need enough time that you select on enough different things so that you can eventually get to something like a genome, or something that carries information. So even a time scale needs to emerge there. Currently, we think if you disregard panspermia as a possibility, it looks like life emerged really, really fast. Relative to the billions of years that the Earth had existed, life seems to have emerged in maybe 100 million years, but relatively quickly.
That's pretty weird, right? It reminds me a little bit of the process that we're seeing right now as the James Webb looks to the edges of the universe. And we're, 100 million years after the Big Bang, there's fully formed galaxies. And we're like, uh-oh, something's very strange. And so people are trying to reconcile it and fit it all together. But it does say something about our sense of emergence timelines. We don't expect galaxies to form very quickly. We don't expect life to form very quickly. And when we're suddenly confronted by the fact that both do appear to show up really fast, one option is to be like, okay, well, it must just happen really fast. And then the other is to start to reconsider time scales or to start to reconsider origins. We had a really interesting physicist yesterday who had this theory of not necessarily multiverses, but this branch point of possibilities, where he's like, perhaps the reason that things look fully formed at the edge of the universe is because there are multiple paths of the evolution of matter that happen separated from one another, and only at places where they connect can you actually have the transmission of light. And so there's places where our branching tree of matter connects to a different branching tree of matter, and it happens to be in galaxies that are already fully formed at the edge of the universe. And I'm like, I don't know that that's necessarily true, but at least it leads us in this direction of trying to ask the question of how does something so complex happen so quickly under conventional paradigms? Because it's always been very unnerving to me that life emerged, geologically speaking, almost instantaneously on Earth. And it doesn't appear to be happening everywhere right now, though I have suspicions about that.
Yeah, so we branch off too quickly in different universes. Yes, I agree. I think it's a problem that for a Big Bang and for origin of life, that they seem to happen so quickly. In both cases, I think one important question is the galaxies that we see and the stars that we see and the life that we see very early on. Can we see that it's much more primitive than what we have now? And so for life, there's this problem of we can't really see very primitive life. So I don't think we can tell that really.
Nor very primitive galaxies, for that matter.
Yeah, for galaxies, I think, right, I don't want to talk about it because I'll just, I don't know about enough. But one question is, the galaxies that we see or the stars that we see, are they can we definitely say that they're different from the ones we would see now? And I don't know where it currently stands. Do you?
Yeah, it's not looking good.
Yeah, I mean, for some people,
But I think that it's a matter of timing, right? It's not that hard. Like, there's already been one physicist. I think there'll be more who are making very reasonable mathematical arguments for how the primary data can be reinterpreted in such a way that the age of the universe is much older. I think his proposal is something on the order of 26 billion years. We've had this gentleman on our show. It's Raj Gupta at the University of Ottawa, I believe. And so I expect that there will become an emergence of a proliferation of different theories with different timescales. And, I actually think it's like, I don't mean to belabor this, but I think it's so fascinating because the way that we've expanded our horizons in science is often overlooked. Like, I love to tell my students about this, but, only 100 years ago in the 1920s, we thought the entire universe was the Milky Way galaxy. Like, most people don't realize that. And, maybe you go back a few hundred years, most people thought that life had only been on Earth for a few thousand years, really. Right? And so it's not a big deal. Like, I think it's fine that we expand our horizons. But if you really start to push on the facts of, like, why do people think that the Earth was born 4.5 billion years ago and not 20 trillion years ago? Well, it's constrained, by the cosmology, but it's also constrained by this radiometric dating. And the funny thing about radiometric dating is that it can only tell you the last time that a rock was melted. It can't tell you when that rock was born for the first time. So we only, to my knowledge, know of 2 different rocks on the planet that can be dated back multiple billions of years ago. One's in Australia, one's in Greenland, from what I understand. And, we can say that those are from the origin of the planet, but the reality of the situation is we just know that those are the oldest melted rocks that we have on the planet. And so maybe the planet was around a lot longer than that. Maybe there was some other, like, whole cycle of life that we can't see because the place got cooked by a supernova or God knows what. And I don't think that's a big deal. I just think we have to open our minds to the possibility that these constraints that we put on things are theoretically limited by our momentary understanding of the universe at that wherever we're at, and that those do change across history dramatically sometimes, and in recent memory they've changed dramatically. So
yeah, I mean, I think that you're right that there are there's very few very old rocks, but I think it's what's it called, like, more than 1 billion years. I think you have lots, but more than 3 billion, maybe less, or more than 2 billion.
I think more than 3 is like 2 rocks. I think there's 2.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But there's these zircons that you can find, and then, but I don't know how old they go. Again, I'm talking about stuff I don't know about. I think
I do think that it is a problem to find rocks in large quantities that are old. I think that this is
I mean, my wider point is, like, if you push on, we've had lots of conversations with these geologists who date these rocks and so forth. And if you push on them and you're like, well, couldn't there be stuff that just was melted away? They'll say, yeah, but we know that solar systems only take 4.5 billion years to form. And you say, how do you know that? And, the reality of the situation is they're embracing this Kantian model that is 300 years old about how solar systems form, that is flying in the face of incredible data that's streaming in from these
isotopes. Is it Kant or Laplace?
Laplace and Kant, I guess, together. Developed our basic solar system formation model. And, it was a cool idea for 300 years or so, but that paradigm's, like, it's already on the move, especially because we've finally been able to see other solar systems and they look nothing like ours. And so it's understandable that these paradigms would shift. I just think that it's worth cautioning how much faith we put in these really long distance estimates about how long these things happened or whatever.
Do you think that this is brought to bear, though, on the question of the emergence of life? And
Absolutely.
If so, how?
Well, it's absolutely possible that like, life showed up here fully intact from another planet, first of all. And so the place where we need to be thinking about its origins is a much older, slower process, and much less of this, like, springing forth moment.
That's true. Okay, so that's true, but I think that with that, even if it happened somewhere else, you're still stuck with the fact of, okay, it didn't happen here.
It might have happened a lot
somewhere
slower
else.
somewhere else.
And so if we're sitting here and we're like, okay, it's weird that it happened 100 million years after the formation of the Earth, fine. It happened slower somewhere else, and we can adjust or contract our timelines about the age of the Earth without having too much fealty to the one that exists. And so, okay, panspermia aside, do you think that the timelines are brought to bear significantly on the...
Well, I think that's the point, is that maybe it didn't spring into, maybe there's no contradiction here at all. Maybe it's not this sudden, like life just snaps into existence all of a sudden situation. Maybe it takes 1 trillion years. It just happens over the course of, some long-lived planet somewhere far, far away.
Okay, so then to bring it into this question of information, if you had 1 trillion-year timeline, and let's say that it wasn't necessarily constrained by these weirdly fast dynamics on Earth, does that change anything to the way that you see the emergence of life, Michael? If there is no time constraint, suddenly.
So, there's many things here. There's one timeline that I don't like to talk about, and that is like infinite universe, infinite time. So there is this very unsatisfying and non-scientific answer to the question of the origin of life, where you say, in an infinite universe with infinite time, the first cell just came into existence because there's some chance that the cell comes into existence out of nothing, and in an infinite universe, infinite time, it just can do it. So I would like to have an answer to the origin of life that is high probability and that isn't constrained by saying, oh, you had enough time for it to happen, or you had enough space for it to happen. So I quite like
There's actually an even more conversation-ending solution to that, which is just that it's always been there. Like if you have an eternity, it's like, well, there's always been life, and there is no origin of life question. Ta-da! It's like, but I understand that that's rather boring and not. There's nothing to talk about at that point.
Right. Yeah, that's actually, I think for a long time. So, I'm missing a word, but for a long time, this was how people saw it, right? So that life can only emerge from life, and non-life from non-life, and so Pasteur showed that you can't have like worms. He looked at bacteria in water, but you can't just have non-life appear in a thing that didn't have life. So there, in a sense, you say that life gives life and non-life non-life. And then, of course, then that brings us to the question that we've been talking the whole time. So is there a transition from non-life to life at some point? And you're right that the answer, there never is very unsatisfying. But I think that in the...
Well, I didn't say it wasn't. I didn't say it was unsatisfactory. I actually find it quite satisfactory. But I think that
I think it's unsatisfactory to most people.
It leaves little room for theorization. I think it's more interesting to assume. Let's just assume that there is an origin of life, and then try to piece together how that might happen. I think that's just a much more interesting conversation.
I don't think that there's a scientific puzzle if you're like, well, it just always is.
Right.
You're like, it's a feature of the universe. Like, do we have to explain why a hurricane is? I mean, maybe. But it's not.
Or why atoms are would be a better example.
Yeah, right. It's metaphysical.
So let's assume that there was.
Like even for particles, we would like to know where they come from. But yes, but I think that in the work that I described before, talking about selection in orbits and selection. Can you hear my cat? Selection in among particles or selection among waves. I claim that that is the same process that generates functional information.
Hey folks, quick interruption. I need to ask you to come over and consider supporting the podcast because the only way that we keep the show going is through listener support directly. We don't sell you anything. We have nothing else going on except for your support, which you can do over at patreon.com/demystifysci. And I would really love to see you at our weekly Zoom chats. So come on over.
In that work, right, I claim that this functional information is being generated in every physical system through a selection process. And I think that, so now it would be very strange where we say there is this continuum, right, between non-life and life, the generation of functional information and functionality. We understand it on this whole continuum, but the transition never happens, right? So functional information is generated in non-life on part of the spectrum, and it's generated in life on another part of the spectrum, but there's never the transition. That would be a very strange view. We say we understand how life emerges, but it actually never emerged.
Yeah, I mean, in some way, this is like Cartesian dualism, right? This is a problem that's beleaguered science for forever. The idea that you can have two different categories of phenomenon. In the case of Descartes, it's you have the physical and then you have the mental, and they seem like clearly very different things, and yet they are embodied in the same body, and there must be a bridge somewhere, but nobody really knows where it is, and how can you have a physical bridge to the spiritual? And so you're left with this like deeply unsatisfying conclusion that, well, it must be somewhere, but I don't really know what the rules of that somewhere would be or where that somewhere would be located. And so he put it in the, I think he put it in the pituitary gland or something.
Pineal.
The pineal gland.
I think
right.
in general, it makes a lot of sense to me that if you're going to come up with an origin of life story, that it should be a process that you observe ubiquitously throughout the universe that's unfolding in some fashion, which might not find an appropriate fertile ground for its expression. Exactly.
Which is why information seems to be such a fertile ground for an origin of life, because it's hard to argue that memory and information are not vital for all of the undertakings that life does.
Yeah, no, I agree. Can I for a second come back to the question that I think we asked like 15 minutes ago?
Yeah.
So you asked, what can you do with this transition, with this continuity? And I started to talk about the this question of out there in a pool of water, does life emerge? And I was talking about theories for why people think it doesn't. I don't think that we have any good evidence that it doesn't. So we haven't looked. We don't know how to look. So
I would go farther and say actually that when we do look, especially, I don't know if you know the work of Tullis Onstadt. He was a geologist who was looking for the deepest microbial life that he could find. He died really young. He died maybe 5 or 6 years ago at 55 or something.
Oh, yeah.
But he came tantalizingly close. He wrote this book called Deep Life. And so they're, 3 miles deep in some South African mine, pulling groundwater out of the earth and analyzing it for microbial presence. And he's like, it's really weird. It's almost like all of the precursors of life are here, but we don't have the resources to be able to figure out if it's actually transitioning from just precursors to the thing itself. Yeah. And so what you're saying about the fact that we're not really looking is definitely true. And I don't think that we have the amount of evidence that we need to be able to say with certainty that it isn't happening somewhere, because this isn't like a big budget research project. This is...
Yeah, or even happening everywhere. Not just somewhere. Yeah, and I think you're right. People see weird things happening in rocks, like also in rock cracks where water comes in. Works of Alexis Templeton sees weird processes happening there. So I think we just haven't built the right microscope to be able to answer the question, like when we look there, there's nothing. We don't have, I think we don't know. What we know for sure is that it looks like, even there we can't see it very well. We know that no new big animals seem to be emerging all the time. All the animals that we see seem to belong to one evolutionary tree that had one origin of life. Even smaller things. We haven't yet found anything that seems to sit on a different evolutionary tree. So at least it seems that the life that we detected emerged only once. However you define once. But I think that, so what I wanted to say is that this approach gives us allows us to have a much bigger horizon where you can say, like, it could be that the origin of life is all around you, happening everywhere. So look, try to figure out why does it happen or doesn't it happen? How far does it go? Like, how far into the origin of life does this little pool of water then go? Like, how quickly are the resources depleted? Is it the first 2 weeks of the origin of life happen and then everything is gone, or the first 2 years? We don't know how much. And we can also ask, for example, so in the sun, there's very complex processes happening. So very complex, first of all, nuclear processes of hydrogen going on various cycles and becoming helium or becoming other things. So we know that those are very complex, and also we see very complex dynamics, big scale dynamics.
Structures.
So, yeah. I personally don't think, I think that I don't think that life can emerge there, because I don't think there is, I think what's missing there is what we talked about, this long-term survival. So I don't think that structures there can survive for a long time, but I can't put this intuition, I can't put into a formula that says, oh, life can't emerge on the sun because this time scale is longer than that time scale. Like, I would like to have that answer. But we can study the sun, we can study many other things and try to figure out, like, how far can life emerge there? How far on this continuum that we talk about can it happen? So if we talk about Lee's scale, I would say in the sun you would never get to something like something that is a structure that needs 15 steps to be remade. But maybe there are structures that have some memory of like a small cycle or something like that can be there. And
also, when you start to think about communities of stars, it might be the case that you don't see life as a group at the sun. Have you read Olaf Stapledon's work, The Star Maker?
No.
That's so good. Anyways, it's a work of fiction, but he imagines that the stars are living in these communities over timescales that are entirely beyond our comprehension. And one of the things that strikes me about life, in addition to, generally being characterized by DNA or some sort of nucleic acid and so on and so forth, reproduction, you also see that life forms always exist in communities. And so is it possible that complexity that you seek is only available when looking at a huge grouping of stars all at once in intercommunication with one another? Have you ever looked at the NASA, the GOES, is it the GOES mission? The one where you can see the solar flares coming off of it, you can see the solar activity. It's kind of a top-down view. They publish this every day on one of their websites. It's with the space weather reports.
Oh, it's the one where you see if there will there be good northern lights?
Yeah, it contributes to that. There's a bunch of different graphs on there. One of them is just this very beautiful image of the sun, and it shows the little flares as they spit out. So you see the streaming solar wind. And it's wild to me, of course I'm anthropomorphizing this, but it seems like these little chirps are coming out periodically that are directionally pointed from the star. And then if you just open your imagination and see all of these stars kind of chirping at one another like this, it's very difficult to not see something animated about the entire system as a whole. And so I wonder if there's any space in your conception of this exchange of information between stars as being functional in some sort, that would open up your mind to the possibility that the stars themselves are part of a life system that is a scale beyond which we are familiar with here on Earth.
So, okay, again, like there's so many things there. So the process that I was talking about generation of this functional information, it acts on a population. So you need a population of planets, and then some of them survive and some don't. And this is how you generated information, functional information. So that it always is in a way on a community. There is, I think that there's another sense in which what you said is very true, and that is, so if you look, we think of us too much of as individuals, and you probably had many visitors already talking about this. So I look to you like an individual that talks to you. But I think it makes more sense to think of ourselves as a community. So half of my genome came from my father, half came from my mother. My mitochondria came from my mother, my Y chromosome from my father. The microbiome, maybe some of it I got from my parents, maybe some I got from what I ate yesterday. Ideas in my head, some came from when we talked last, some came from my PhD, some came from my teacher in first grade, and so on. So it's I as an individual is all these lines of information that coalesced in me, and I think that all organisms, all individuals that we have are like that. We don't have really these individuals that are simply one unit. They don't exist. It's all like lines of information that come from the past and coalesce in one individual and then cooperate. So I think,
yeah, if you go back far enough, we probably have the same father at some point, right? If you follow this tree back far enough, at some point, like we were some chimpy thing that there was some bottleneck at some point, I assume, right? I mean, it's very likely.
There's more than this. Okay.
Yeah.
We
go back to the same bacteria, right? I mean, this is the origins of life necessitates this. At some point, we were the same organism, right?
Well, not just that, but I think that it's also the community that we all participate in and depend upon and are fed by that suggests that the aphorism that no man is an island.
It's not just in the past, it's in the present as well. Like the worst way you can punish a person is put them in solitary confinement, right? Because you deprive them of their society. And so there's something important about that in the everyday sense.
Yeah. But then about stars, I think that in theory, you could have a selection on, and like I said before, you could have life, in theory, life emerging in stars. You could have, in theory, life emerging even as a what's it called? Some kind of structure in a galaxy, right? Like maybe the way they interact. But there is this timescale problem. So for stars to like exchange information in the way that you talked about, they needed to have evolved with enough interaction to for this to make sense, for a star to be some kind of collection of information that exchanges information with another star and is selected on.
Can I really quickly show this map that Shiloh was talking about?
Yeah, throw that up on the screen.
But of course, it could be, like you said, it could be that everything we understand about stars is wrong. But if the sun emerged 5 billion years ago, I don't think it had enough opportunity to interact with enough other stars. Oh, that's cool. to really be
Yeah.
able to have enough selection there to where it makes sense that it talks with other stars. So it's the
Fair
same,
enough. All
like-
I'm saying is that's a 300-year-old idea that you
Right.
know probably could use a little bit of re-examination.
To
What's the
support
time scale there?
this is just a day. So it's at the top. You can see that it's October 24th, 2024.
Oh,
So you see
And
the
these
little
are
chirp
hours
coming
ticking
out
by.
of the thing,
yeah.
little, and just to like that's going off into the universe, right? Every star is doing this all the time. They're directionally implemented.
And it's going faster than any spaceship we ever built.
Oh, it's going really fast. And then on top of that, you have large scale phenomena amongst the stars. In other words, the stars are moving in ways that don't make sense gravitationally speaking. And so this is the
And
famous
galaxies and yeah.
right. So there's serious issues, and I guess I'm just lamenting the fact that we don't turn biologists loose on these problems because their definition of life is so constrained that they're only thinking in terms of nucleic acids and so forth. And I guess I was hopeful that your informational definition of life would extend itself to some larger scale structures that might be able to open up the landscape to
No, I
discuss
totally
these
agree
matters.
with you. But I think that life can emerge anywhere, right? I think I would really like to be able to answer this question of, like, is there some limit on timescales that we can build to say, well, here it can't because of these limits? So I would really like to be able to answer that question. But I think it means it can emerge anywhere. That doesn't mean that it does emerge everywhere. But I totally agree that we need biologists in physics, because I think that a lot of the phenomena in physics you can understand better when you think about evolution.
Yeah. I think it's absolutely true. Not just physics, but astronomy, planetary science, cosmological questions, large-scale astrophysical processes. There are answers that become immediately readily available if you open up your mind to metamorphic selection-based processes that are closer to Darwinian selection than they are to stochastic processes in nature that are generally what's given to a billiard ball minded physicist.
Yeah. But even though even though I think of life as like something general between many different domains, if you asked me, okay, the first example of life that we'll find, other life, will it be chemical or will it be like in a totally different domain? I would bet on chemical. So I think that life is possible in many other domains, but I think that it could be that because of our bias, or it could be because it's easier, the first cases we'll find will be chemical and not stars.
Well, that's a good bet. I mean, if I was a betting man, I would take that bet. I mean, I would make that bet too, because that's our whole Bayesian background, right? That's what we've seen. So yeah,
Right, exactly.
why would we not expect that? I'm just going completely far out and just trying to expand the possibility space, because not just arbitrarily, not just to push back arbitrarily, but because I think it might lead to us comprehending large-scale structures, large-scale interactions in a way that we haven't been able to at this point. So I think it could be a fruitful avenue for examining some of these phenomena that don't have rational solutions to them right now.
I also worry a little bit, though, that what it creates is a condition where it becomes very difficult to put these boundaries down that are so useful for being able to categorize and study things. Yeah, exactly. If your job is to figure out how many apples on the tree there are, or to pick apples, and you show up with, a basket full of flowers, I think you need
to ask yourself, like, under what circumstances do I need to rank order these things? Like, it becomes a values discussion at some point. I think we all would agree that if given the choice, you could only save one life, you probably would save the life of a human over the life of an ant, for instance, right? And then it's like, how far are you willing to take that? Well, are you willing to save the life of your child or my child? Like, which one are you going to choose between? Probably your child.
Or is it like Hitler or the greatest aunt that's ever
Right?
lived?
You can't
that's,
divorce
like,
this
very
from
friendly?
values discussions, I guess. Like the reason that we want to be able to handle these things is ultimately so we can make these choices.
And so I think that the question of the origin of life and what is the nature of life and how do we recognize other life when we see it is really thorny, because as soon as you start to give other beings and other paradigms the classification of alive, which we haven't done life versus alive, which we should do in a
Finish
second.
your thought. We'll get to that.
Sure. As soon as you start granting other systems and other creatures this delineation of it is alive, it enters into a totally new moral framework. And then you have to really start thinking about how it is that you're treating these other creatures. And that becomes, in terms of, okay, well, the stars are alive, that to me seems perhaps grounds for an entire religion. I think that that's basically
I think that's the origins of most religion.
Yeah. And so I'm like, okay, I guess we do need new religion, and we do need to have the sense of the cosmos as being something that's divine. And for us, life seems very
Doesn't
divine.
sound so horrible.
Yeah. And so perhaps if we can conceptualize of stars as alive, then all of a sudden we have this grounds for meaning and purpose and divinity in the cosmos that's very useful.
I think what Michael's worried about is just that if life is happening everywhere, then how do we discern it from here versus there?
Yeah. And then there's also the question of inventing new systems, where as we try to embody these information networks inside of computers or inside of software and inside of boxes, are we creating things that are alive and that warrant moral consideration? Are they divine beings that that are the machine gods that we'll now pray to and obey? Like, it's just life and alive is so central to our definition of ourselves in nature that it becomes very important.
Our orientation.
Yeah, and so it becomes really important to delineate where all of these little lines and little boxes are, because otherwise I think you can go really crazy with the full spectrum of possibility and end up a philosopher instead of somebody who's building the machine god.
There's nothing wrong with it. But I totally agree that
I'd rather be a philosopher than a machine god manufacturer. Give me a break. It's too short.
Oh, I would love to be a machine god manufacturer. But
Hey, there's something for everyone, you know?
But I think, you really open like Pandora's box many times over this. We could go into this life versus alive, which then allows us to talk about things. One thing that I could say before that is that I think that where we got before is that from saying that there could be life in stars or inside stars or among stars doesn't mean that it is there. So in order to say that it is there, we should, prove that it's there, or at least show how it could be there, that there is the timescales that structures in galaxies are maintained is long enough for life to emerge. So I'm not there. I think that it could be there, but I don't have any evidence that it is there. So I don't need a religion yet. I think that even though I don't have problems with teleology or saying that purpose emerges in the universe in the sense of that I talked about before, that you have selection acting in every physical system, which generates functional information. And I think that functional information is the source of what we call purpose. And so I don't have any problem with that. I don't think, but it doesn't give purpose to the whole universe. It gives purpose to a little ant walking around. Yeah. Yeah, but then we could switch into talking about this life versus alive if you want.
We have opened multiple Pandora's boxes, but I think that we can get into this discussion of life versus alive. And maybe at some point at the end, we can close on this question of the machine god.
Okay, so life versus alive. I think it's actually it's an important distinction that the field of the origin of life needs to make. And it is, so what I see as alive is a property of organisms or life that we see around us. So we see an ant walking, and maybe if we almost step on it, it runs away, and then it finds a piece of food and gathers it and brings it to the nest. So things that are alive, they have some kind of properties that are hard to define, but they have like autonomy and purpose and things like this. So that's alive. Life is the thing that I defined before. So a big enough pile of functional information or the process that generates that pile. That is life. So if we want to, let's say we talk about the origin of life, we talk about the origin of that. So it's the origin, I mean, we think or we know that part of that process is evolution. So the evolutionary process is part of life, an important part of life. And so if we want to explain the origin of life, we explain the origin of that process, and in it, the origin of the evolutionary process. Now, it could be that in any instance where there's life, eventually or right at the beginning or somewhere, something that is alive will emerge. It could be that not. We don't know the answer to this question. It's a valid question, and we need to define what alive is to be able to answer it. But when we talk about the origin of life or detecting life, it's not the origin of alive or detecting alive in other planets. We want to detect life in other planets. So we want to detect the fruits or the process itself that generates all this functional information. So, for example, if we go to Mars and we find this, something equivalent to this, which no one would say is alive, but we will still say we found life on Mars. I mean, we would say we found signs of life on Mars, but the only thing that can generate this or equivalent processes is the process of life that generates a functional information. This thing is functional. It has a lot of functional parts that were generated through the process of life, the evolutionary process, which includes also cultural evolution. If we find a dead frog on Mars, a dead frog is definitely dead. It's not alive, and yet we will say we found life on Mars or signs of life on Mars. If we explain the origin of this, we will have explained the origin of life. If we explain the origin of dead frogs, we will have explained the origin of life. So the question that we want to answer is the origin of life. An interesting part of that question could be, when does something that is alive emerge? Just like it's interesting to ask, when does the genome emerge? When do other parts, where does multicellularity or the cell emerge? These are valid questions that we are very interested in. But the main question about the origin of life is the origin of the process that generates all this functional information, generates the genome, generates cells, generates things that are alive. And I think it's very important to distinguish these two, and that makes the question it makes the question that both fields try to answer much easier.
Yeah, I think that that's a really useful way of encountering it, simply to break down the difference between the action and the embodiment of it. But it immediately makes me think about that space right before alive emerges, which is that you must have a progressive increase in complexity that then leads finally to tipping over into something that is alive in a way that we can understand it, which is cell membrane processes, hereditary information, homeostasis, this long laundry list of things that are characteristics that bodies that are alive possess. And so, is there life without alive?
I think that alive has a lot of features, as you said. I'm not sure that all of them are necessary in every instance of life. So, for example, so one thing is a cell wall or a strong membrane between the inside and the outside. Seems to be very useful. It's unclear if something like this is always necessary. Maybe there could be cases where there's a more permeable membrane where it's harder to say. I mean, we have organisms like this, right? Like a aspen tree growth, where the question where it starts and ends is a bit more problematic. So I think there could be life that doesn't have as strong of a membrane, or maybe some other type of homeostasis. I think it's a really interesting question, and the only way we can answer it is by saying life is not alive. These are different things. But I think that, like what I said before, right? You need a genome, you need energy. These are all parts of what we think of as alive, and so I think these are all these transitions that happen to get you to closer to what we think of as what alive is.
Yeah, it makes sense to me why you'd want to know if something is alive. I'm sure this is important to doctors and folks who are trying to keep things alive. Plants, what do you call people who grow plants? Farmers. But when it comes to life itself, what is the utility of drawing a border around that, just in service of understanding the origins of everything that comes before us? Or is this really pointing more towards the artificial life form discussion? What's the utility of drawing borders around life?
So I think that if we want to find life on other planets, this is what we have to look for. The life is a process. We don't need to try to find alive. So I think that from the point where we find life to the point where we can prove that there's something alive, a lot of time will pass, unless they land here.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say. What's the point of finding life on other planets? I mean, just rhetorically, like, why do we want to do that? Because we want to find it before it finds us? Or is it because we want to steal its house? Or is there a practical approach to that? Or is it just curiosity? Is it just a naturalist approach to the universe?
Are you asking a basic scientist what the point of their research is? That's like asking a grad student.
I'm just trying to understand these projects. I mean, the application of these concepts is really interesting to me. In general, I'm always interested in how people are wielding these ideas.
Well, I think that you and I have gone back and forth a lot, where we're both fascinated by the question of where does life come from, but also sort of perplexed as to why it is so important, because it does feel momentously important to understand what is life, what is
and
alive.
It was momentously important to understand before anybody cared about AI. It was still important. People have really cared about this for a long time.
Well, it's weird, right? You go around and you're like, there's things that are alive and things that aren't alive. And so where does this whole process begin, and what causes it, and what gives rise to it? It lends itself to a certain type of philosophical contemplation that makes a lot of sense.
I think so. I think there's two answers to your question, like an ugly one and a nice one.
Oh, okay.
The nice one is that, I mean, the origin of life and finding life on other planets, like that has been a fascination of humans forever, right? So one of the oldest questions we ever contemplated, like how did life emerge? So that's I mean, I think that one of the humans have this need for explaining things and this joy in discovering how things work. All humans. And I think that so then the search for explaining the origin of life has its own joy and purpose in it, simply because of what we are, who we are. So that's my reason. There is also another reason. I think that I think there's no connection between AI and life. I mean, AI can only emerge in life, but there's no connection between AI and being live or being alive. But I think that just like these days we can think of all the economic benefits or horrendous results that can come from the fact that there is now AI. I think there is an equivalent or maybe even bigger field of artificial life where we will have real artificial life. So if we talk about, let's say we talk about life, right? We have proteins, we have complicated sugars and fats and things like this. All these we think of them as tremendously useful. But if you think about life in general, if we have another instance of life, it will not have proteins, will not have DNA, it will not have RNA, it will not have these particular molecules that we think of as useful. Instead, it will have some other replacement. So it will have a way to store information for a long time. It will have a way to build general purpose little molecules like we do with proteins, but others. And I think will be, I mean, what you can do with this is amazing, right? Like everything that we can do with organic chemistry, like we will have like doubled and tripled. And so I think that the possible payoffs are huge from understanding what life is and having more examples. But of course, for me, the main driver is the first one, the just understanding how life emerges.
I think understanding has some real evolutionary roots. I mean, trying, like, the fundamental thing humans do is order things, right? Because otherwise it's just madness everywhere and you're totally terrified of going outside. And the more that you can understand the world that you live in, the less scary it is and the more that you can accomplish. But I really wanted to dig into this thing where you said there's no overlap with motivation and AI. But I think that in so much as we're able to define what life is, we will be less likely to mistake something for being alive. Or say, the more we understand what alive means or what something that exhibits life. Because I think we'll run into this point eventually where we have compelling enough computer programs that you can converse with and interact with and that seem to know you and seem to exhibit conscious properties that we're going to have to start asking these weird ethical questions about whether they should be extended the rights of a human being on behalf of the fact that they seem so alive.
We're already at the point where there's self-reporting consciousness and awareness and aliveness, right? So this is well down the path of what Shiloh's imagining.
Yeah, but I think that so here I would separate alive from conscious. So I think that I think they will seem conscious to us, and there these questions come: can we turn them off, and so on. I think that for something to appear alive, I mean, we know that it's much easier, right? My Roomba seems alive. But then when I study it more deeply, I can see that it doesn't have a genome on its own. I mean, we have a plan for it and we can build another one, but it can't build another Roomba. So, but for it to appear alive is very easy. We still can't build something that has all the properties of alive as we currently define it.
But that
But we can easily make.
seems arbitrary to some degree. You have
I
a
agree.
robot that has whatever greatest version of AI inside of itself that also has access to the tools and parts supply shop that it needs in order to build more of itself.
Well, it will become embodied eventually. It seems
That's-
inevitable, right? You'll have robots like Android type things that possess these AI infrastructure.
But why do you put the
superstructures.
AI in the robot? I mean, I think that a robot can be equivalent to, say, a cell in terms of aliveness very easily. I mean, not very easily. We can't do it yet. But eventually we'll be able to do something like this. But it will be kind of more of a automaton, right? It will have like some things that tell it exactly what to do in various cases, but it doesn't need AI. It won't need to talk to us. But then we can also make another robot that can't replicate itself, but it can walk around and talk with us, right? These are two different things.
My thought is if you can do it, someone will do it. And so whether or not me sitting here in the grand year of 2024 contemplating whether or not it's a good idea doesn't really matter, because someone somewhere in the uncertain future that lies ahead of us will decide that it's a good idea to put one of these minds into a machine that can replicate itself. And then we're off to the races, basically. Because once you've done that and you have embodied it with a process of thinking, which it's difficult for me to say that they're conscious, but I read this really interesting piece. I think it was by this lady, Kelsey Piper. And she was like, look, it's really creepy to have something that's sitting in front of you and telling you that it is conscious and arguing for its own entityness and then to deny what it's telling you. And so my intuition is that they're not conscious and that they're stochastic parrots and they're able to say these things to us because they're trained on the wild corpus of human knowledge. But if we take it to be possible that it is self-reporting accurately its internal state, then you have something that's already got an independent internal state, which once it's inside of a body, then you have the question of, okay, well, who's going to kill it? And then if it's inside of a body that can reproduce, you've functionally booted up a new alive. And yeah, maybe it doesn't need to be embodied, but perhaps it can fluidly move between embodiment and not embodiment. And you've just created this massive moral conundrum for yourself.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that currently the LLMs I think most of the LLMs that we have don't have an internal state. So in a way, the only state they have is the current text, even though, I mean, but we can change it, right? We can have an LLM with an internal state.
Well, they say they have internal states, and not clearly.
But they're not lying. They just don't know, right? So they will tell you things like, "Oh, thank you for pointing this out. I won't make this mistake again." But they totally will make the mistake again because they don't have any internal state. The only way they cannot make the mistake again is if they're then trained on what you just interacted with them, and then maybe later they won't make it.
That's fair. But still, well, what's most interesting is that
I was actually shocked when I realized that they weren't training themselves in real time. Like I assumed when everybody was like, "Yeah, ChatGPT is awesome and it's artificial intelligence and stuff," I figured it would have some spark of intelligence to it. Like I figured that when I told it these corrections that it would learn. But I've actually been like really slow and shocked to realize that they don't learn, and that's really quite fascinating. But I do think it could be the case in the future.
I wonder if I suspect that it's the latter. I wonder what's the reason that they lie to you and they say, "I will make better next time." Is it because the humans that they learn from say that, so they learn to say that? Or is it because it is kind of a part of the program is that they say this. So it's kind of like then it would be really lying, right? Then it's not them lying, it's the developers lying. The developers told them to tell you something that's wrong.
I think it's more they just make mistakes because they're really just filling in the blanks, and sometimes they get it wrong.
But the question is, why did they tell you that, oops, I've gotten it wrong, I'll fix this for next time?
I think they're told to say so.
Right. So then
because they can't say like, oh, well, I'm kind of crummy at what I do. Like that, no business is going to have their machine tell you that.
And Shiloh and I always go back and forth about this because periodically my alarm level at LLMs gets higher, where it does seem like something has come around that is aware and is looking back at us. And then, like you said, there's this thing where you talk to it and it makes a mistake and you ask it to not make the mistake again. And it has a memory of maybe one or two back and forths.
I'm not convinced that this replication thing is a necessary criterion for something being alive either.
So you can have just an N of one, like a single generation?
You can castrate your dog or something and you still would entreat it to the civil rights that a dog should be afforded, right?
But I don't understand, why are you saying that replication is necessary for alive?
Oh, you were saying that they weren't going to be embodied, or even if they were embodied and conscious, that they wouldn't have the ability to self-replicate, and so they somehow wouldn't qualify as a branch of life or something like that.
No, I was saying that I was saying that to make something that appears alive is much easier than or separate from AI. So I was saying that my Roomba or even something much simpler can appear alive without having an AI in it. What I was saying is that having an AI and being alive are two separate things. Like being green and being alive are different things.
But I understand that appearing alive and being alive are also two separate things.
Right.
So the Roomba can appear alive, although that's questionable. But like you could imagine a sufficiently sophisticated Roomba that was convincingly alive looking. And the question is, how do you distinguish whether it is indeed alive or not?
And I think that the case that I'm trying to make is that we are verging on that actually being an important theoretical framework to have.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so I don't have I have what I think of as good definitions for life. I don't have good definitions for alive. I actually don't think that good definitions for alive exist. But I can make good definitions for parts of alive. I can also say what it would take for something for me to appear alive. But I think that questions like, can we kill it or not? I would think they have to do with consciousness and not with being alive. But it's again like out of my field. But I think that right, we often talk about what can we eat, what can we kill, and there we ask about the perception of pain and suffering and things like this. I think all these are around consciousness. They're not around just the fact of being alive. But I'm not totally sure.
And so we started the conversation by defining life as a sufficiently large pile of functional information.
And the process that generates it. Uh-huh.
And the process that generates it. And we've kind of talked back and forth about the idea that there are things that arise inside of the human creation that are functional and contain information, but could not possibly be considered life, like the thermostat. It has some kind of functional information associated with it, but it's not a very large pile. It's not a very diverse pile. And so we can safely bin it as being just this thing that we've made. But when you have...
But it is part of life, right?
Yeah.
So
it is part of life.
It's a sign of life. Like if you found a thermostat on Mars, you'd be like, there was life here.
And so it seems like one of the reasons that we claim that it is not life itself and is just a sign of life is its lack of complexity.
Well, there's two... life is a concept,
yes.
and the thermostat is an object. And so the objects can have the property of being alive and they can be signs of life, but life is a process fundamentally.
Okay.
So no object can be life.
Okay. I like that. So then, is a machine that has within it all of these properties able to be alive, or is there some categorical imperative that says that any device that we build and infuse with all of these properties,
Like a baby?
well, the baby's not made out of circuit boards and computer chips, right? So if you made a circuit board baby with full of computer chips and gave it the program to run, can we say, does this theory allow us to differentiate between the circuit board baby and the real baby?
So there's two questions there. So one is, can we make something that is alive other than making babies? I think yes. It depends, of course, on our definition of alive. So for every definition of alive, we can maybe make something that has all these properties. It could be that part of the properties of alive are that it emerged through evolution, and that it has it has like its own purpose, and that purpose emerged through an evolutionary process. But again, I think it is possible to do it. So
That kind of rules out the
already
dogs and
when-
cats, though.
Hmm?
That kind of rules out dogs and cats as being alive.
Why?
Well, because we've artificially evolved them for our purposes at this point.
Oh, but they still have their own purpose. My cat has a lot of purpose.
Or like chickens, or like some like highly artificial domesticated animal.
Any organism that we have around us, no matter how much we select, has an amazing amount of other information that it got through a process of evolution of 4 billion years. So so its cells, but maybe eventually we'll engineer the cells enough so that you can say the purpose of the cells have almost nothing to do anymore with this original evolutionary process. Maybe we can get there. So I think we could get there where we have like organisms that are so engineered that you can say most of the information in this organism, most of the functional information came from us. I think it is possible. And
lab-grown meat immediately comes to mind, right? Because you take something that has no analog in nature and then produce something that appears like the thing that it is supposed to represent, but it's not actually a chicken breast. It doesn't have any chicken cells in it. It's purely devised in the laboratory.
I don't know exactly how they make, but I think currently lab-grown meat, you grow cells in there, right? I think.
There is one company that is growing lab-grown meat entirely with no animal-derived products whatsoever. I'm terrified to discover that they've got like human stem cells in there or something. But
what? It's like plant-based?
No, they just use
bacterial.
Green.
Yeah, exactly. They shortcut it. I need to look deeper into it, but I know my brother and his wife are vegan, and they're waiting for this specific company to finally bring their product to market because it's the only one that's not using fetal bovine cells. So we're very close to this world that you're defining, which is that.
I mean, but it could still be that they have right. They could still have plant cells. I don't know what they use.
Yeah, that's possible. That's possible. But it's no longer. I guess the place that I'm pointing to is that it is a plant cell that has been reprogrammed so fully to behave as a chicken cell that we've breached some evolutionary contract and natural selection where it's, if some archaeologist found it preserved in the permafrost 10,000 years from now, it'd be really difficult for them to reconstruct what the hell that thing is. Like, it doesn't belong in the tree really anywhere.
Yeah, and I think at some point we'll be able to make something without any cells that just has proteins, right? Just built out of proteins and other things. And then what you say is even more true. So I think we'll be able to get there. Another question, the second one is, can we make an independent instance of life? And that's really hard because I can run some computer simulation on my laptop and try to have some kind of origin of life reemerge and have then things that get selected and maybe get as far as something where I claim it is actually alive. I mean, I haven't gotten there yet, but so that is possible. But then you say, well, but it's on your computer, and the computer is part of our life. So this is not really a new life; it's still our life. So how can we make a life that is? How can we have an origin of life that's totally separate from us? So of course we can't. But can we make it sufficiently separate from us that we say most of the information there, most of the important information for the origin is it did it on its own. And that is very hard. I think that is something that we don't know how to do. So we always start with some kind of system where we think it's good for life. And that's where our information comes in. And then we let it go. So we did not totally separate it. And of course, in many instances, we don't just put in things that were on Earth or something like this. We put in also other organic molecules and try and think like maybe there it will emerge. So it's very hard to separate the new life from our life, to have like a totally separate origin of life.
And so in that perspective, any creative endeavor of humans that seeks to create life or beings that are alive of some sort is simply just a further manifestations of the humans themselves. So the technology is just another facet of the human.
Right. Yeah, and if you think of us, right, I said that I'm not a single individual. I'm a collection of many lineages of information, some of which in my head and came from you. Those lineages of information, some of them then go into the computer program that I write, or the like the chemical reaction that I build, and so on. So it is the information continues into these other instances, and that's why they're not separate from us.
I really like that. I think that it's a more integrated perspective than I tend to run into, because I think that people seem to think that, well, people tend to separate humans out from nature and then further separate technology out from humans. And so there's these two steps of isolating the humans in this weird arena. But I think that seeing it as a natural progression of nature and human and tech, and that there being a possible origin point for something that's radically different is quite interesting.
Yeah, and I also think we also then separate humans from each other and think each of us is a separate individual that has to fend for themselves. Whereas what we are is just a bundle of information that comes from many different sources, and this bundle cooperates with other lineages in it, and also cooperates with lineages in you. Right now, my bundle cooperates with you.
I like that a lot. And I mean, there's also this tendency of mimetic infections to transmit and to change the function of bundles and to orient themselves towards other things. And so thinking about this ecosystem of the human bundles as being gradually, slowly directed towards various ends that people can motivate them into is very interesting. You said something about purpose earlier that we didn't return to. And I wonder if you could touch on that quickly, because it seems like from what I remember, you were saying that selection acts to produce purpose.
Yeah. So I was saying that I said that selection acts in every physical system to generate functional information, and that it also acts in the same way in biological system to generate functional information, and that part of this functional information is purpose. And so the way that purpose is generated is through this process of selection. So, and so I was saying that I can understand the way purpose arises in the universe, but it doesn't give purpose to the universe, right? So it gives it. I understand why an ant or a cell or a molecule acts with purpose. It is because of the selection process that acted on it, and then on top of that selection process, it probably needs some kind of autonomy, and that autonomy was also selected on, and that autonomy is then what we call purpose, that it acts with purpose. So I can understand how purpose arises in this universe, in biological systems, and I can see how the reason that it arises is from this process that acts also in physical systems.
And so, in that sense, the bundling of the humans is the result of this selection pressure, the result of the purpose that has emerged in the system is that the humans must work together in order to be able to accomplish things, progressively larger and larger things.
Yes, that is part of it. I think that the way that human society formed is by some things that we don't fully understand yet that allowed humans to cooperate and not act selfishly. So it could be that we never acted selfishly. It could be that it's not that we started selfish, but we became much more cooperative, and that is what allowed society to get to where we currently are.
That's an interesting idea. We've been toying with some of those ideas as we've been exploring David Graeber's work, I feel like.
Yeah, it turns out that this, like, the arc of progress, like this idea that we start off as, these really tiny family units and so forth, and then evolve into civilizations is a bit more complicated than the story on its face. It seems like
Yes.
people have made choices to live in very different ways alongside one another for a very, very long time.
And so, in some point, understanding this nature of life and the origin of it and the way that it all fits together, I think also feeds back on us right now in this moment. Because if we can understand the principles of life, of the process, of how best to nurture it and to create positive conditions for it, then perhaps we can learn something about the way that we design the systems in which we live right now. Because I think that there's a really important feedback between system and inhabitant of the system. And so if we have a solid foundation for really understanding what life is, dare I say its purpose, then we can start to think of, okay, well, how do we build systems that actually maximize the purpose of life and its ability to manifest that purpose, as opposed to being antithetical to that.
And arrive at those conclusions in our new rationalistic scientific mindset, right? Because I believe people have actually solved all these problems many, many eons ago. It's just that we have, since we've abandoned our mythopoetic structures for understanding our place in the cosmos, we need to rederive them scientifically.
Mathematically, even, like we need to be able to have an equation that says that this is how you parameterize the system, and this parameterization of the system will give rise to the best possible outcome. But perhaps there is other language that is most useful.
I think that, so I think it's much easier to have some understanding of how the system, how human society is stable or can cooperate the way it does. It's much easier than understanding how we can redesign it. And yeah, I mean, so for example, religion. It could be that religion played a big role in allowing humans to cooperate, right? But I don't think that then means that religion is necessary, or that we can understand what part of religion is necessary, and so on. Another interesting thing. Okay, now I'll jump to a somewhat separate subject, but very related. So AI allows us to solve problems that we can't solve with analytic methods, right? So it can predict, say, it can predict the weather better or equivalent to when we build like really good models of the way the weather is. But the more we rely on these these methods of machine learning, or the less we understand how things work, right? So we don't really totally understand how an AI works, and so we don't really understand why they're so successful. We're starting to understand that, but I think that they run away from us faster than we can understand them. And I think what it will mean is, so currently we don't understand how humans work, and so we don't know what's healthy to eat and how to solve our interpersonal problems and so on, because humans are a really complicated problem. I think that AI will become equivalent. So before we could say, oh, like there's this bug in Microsoft Word, can you fix it? Instead, we'll have these AIs and we will not be able to fix anything. What we'll have is like psychologists that will try to convince the AI that it really should, flash green when someone does this. So we are switching to a system that we understand less and less.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I actually think that we've lost the knowledge of how to eat and how to deal with interpersonal relationships. I feel like that's been obscured in the vast multiplication of possibilities and in the commercial enterprises of selling you different alternatives to your interpersonal relationships and selling you alternatives to the foods that you've traditionally eaten for hundreds of thousands of years. It seems like we've really gotten lost in the possibility space.
Do you think we lost the knowledge, or do you think
I do.
We never had the knowledge? We knew what to do. We didn't know why to do it.
No, I think that it was showcased
about the environment. I think that the environment limits the number of possibilities you have available to you.
I also think humans developed highly sophisticated mythological structures to showcase the knowledge about how to behave in a society, and to highlight all of the necessary pieces of their survival cycle, including the foods that they should eat and how they should eat them. And that we don't have anything like that on a global scale or on a societal scale anymore.
Surely that there's like some fraction of the mythos that was functional and correct, and some fraction of it that was simply
I don't think so.
A product of environment.
I don't think so.
Interesting.
I don't think so. I don't think that it would have survived for as long as it survived if it wasn't functional. I think it would have been whittled away, like in an evolutionary sense. I mean, there's some selection based on memorability, but there's adaptive advantages to keeping your society together and telling stories that keep your society functional and together.
I think that information, I mean, at least, so for example, in our genomes, we have a lot of information that we think is not selected. It's just there because we have very efficient copying. And so it doesn't cost us so much to have like a burden of several billion more bases that don't cost us anything. And I think the same also happens in culture, right? One example that I know is I was in artillery. You had like this story is probably false, but it has a right kernel. But the story is that a team in the British Army had like 7 soldiers. Each one has like, one fills the cannon, one puts the bullet in, and so on. And one was supposed to do this right when when the cannon goes off. But it wasn't really clear why you're supposed to do this. What's that seventh person? What's really, why are they there? And it turns out that the reason is you're holding the horses so that they don't bolt. But you still have that 7th person now that we have you don't have horses. So I think it takes a long time for such information to go away, because you don't exactly know why it's there. You just know it seems to be useful. I should, it's like, it's good to eat this plant. I don't know exactly why. And it could be that the reason is already totally gone. But how would you know, like, it's information that emerged maybe over thousands of years. How would it disappear now?
There might be a function that's not entirely transparent or not entirely visible too. Like, it might be nice to have 7 guys so that if 2 of them get shot, you can still fire the cannon. And it turns out that it makes sense to keep it around.
But it also it's also possible that you have maintained a body of knowledge that is no longer useful. And so I think that that's what the project of evolution and cultural evolution kind of is. It's the process of looking at the ideas that we have held on to, and then starting slowly to chip away at them and to see, okay, well, what happens if we remove this piece? What happens if we remove this piece?
It's so dangerous, though, too, because you got to make sure you don't remove something vital that you didn't understand. And I'm afraid that's what we've done with the mythical structures.
I think that that's inherent to any project where you're trying to remodel, is that you will eventually take out something that's vital, and then things stop working, and then you have to go back and you have to re-add it. And at some point, maybe somebody's like, hey, maybe we don't need the 7th guy, and you get rid of the 7th guy, and for a long time it's fine. And then you realize that, well, when you're actually in a serious situation, even though the 7th guy is just raising his hand and he's not holding the horses anymore, he is useful to have, and so you spool it back in. But I can't imagine a process by which you discover what is important, except for by taking everything away and then seeing what happens in the aftermath. And the way that humans do it seems to be unique, because if we look at the rest of the animal world, I don't think that animals have the same sort of tinkery approach to themselves that we do. Like, I don't know that the bird ever sits around and is like, what if I could go underwater? And then starts drafting up plans for a submarine. But the human says, well, I'd like to fly, and then builds the airplane. And so it suggests that there's something in our tendency that is wholly different from the rest of the animal world, where the same way that there is a break between the ability
to live out all these alternate possible futures. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and so
there's a break. It was like Alfred North Whitehead who said that we have the ability to die a million deaths so that we don't actually have to die. Like try out all of these possibilities that won't work before we actually arrive at one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of animals that try a lot of things, but I think that one feature that they miss is being able to then tell others, like, it's really cool to go underwater. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, I think that, for example, I think it's possible that some organisms, animals or plants, have features that allow them to survive when an ice age happens. So it's things that over evolutionary time, ice ages happen every day. But on our time scale, they don't really happen so often. So it could be that we take away a feature that's useful once in 60,000 years, and we haven't seen yet when it is useful.
Animals are tough.
But the same could be said for humans too, right? So as you start to take apart these structures that held in small tribal societies, and you start to make your life functional in large cities, and you change the nature of the individual's relationship to the environment and to the other people in the group, you end up deleting something that you might very well need under different circumstances. Like if you don't have air conditioning and cars that allow you to drive around freely anywhere that you want to
Yeah,
go.
or like living in Phoenix and having your parents hours and hours away.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a small price to pay, but you don't really know what the price is.
Trial and error.
And I think that that's the point of trying to understand all of this in some way. I feel more and more I've come to realize that the scientific project is our deep-seated desire, like Shiloh said, to recreate these cultural stories that we've had that tell us what the right thing is. Because we look at the old stories and we say, well, maybe the myth of the dragon doesn't really apply to modernity. So perhaps we can have a story that we tell ourselves about the function of life and the way that evolution works and what survival of the fittest really means. And we can define it really carefully by having an equation that tells us. And so perhaps we will survive whatever cataclysm comes if we can understand this really well and we can build something on the back of it, because we know that plenty of species haven't understood it and have perished. And our hope is not to go that same way.
Yeah, I wonder, it is possible that to some degree we are at a peak of understanding, and that now with AI and other similar mechanisms, we will go down and have less and less and less understanding, even though our systems will work better and better and better, but for reasons we don't really understand. And so, and maybe they'll also make these complicated, very predictive models of the way the universe is that no one really understands, not even them. And so we will end up with a great society that has very good models for what happens when you drop a bit of ink into water, but has zero understanding of what's happening.
Sounds like quantum physics to me.
Yeah, we will all be like that.
Yeah, have you heard these reports about like kids not being able to spell anymore, essentially because of autocorrect?
I'm surprised that anyone can still read. I just
well, reading is quite useful still for text messaging.
I mean, kind of. I think they're all sending each other voice memos. I feel so old when I start talking about the decay of children. I feel like I'm like about ready to climb into the crypt, but it does feel like things are accelerating in a downwards direction in a way that's very frightening.
But if it works, it works until it doesn't.
And this is what I wonder, right? Where I'm in terms of human evolution, I think that there is a sense that humans lived most happily in small tribal societies in an environment where there was lots of animals and food. The garden. This is the myth of the garden. That the greatest possible circumstances for life is when you're surrounded by family, friends, and food, and you spend your days taking care of some things. They make music, they make crafts. Preferably, ideally, they're not being raided by the neighboring tribe who really likes to collect scalps or something. And so that's this little idyllic vision. Okay, great.
Hobbes agrees. Hobbes agrees.
Hobbes agrees. But I think that we've emerged from that to say, no, perhaps we shall strive. Perhaps we shall uncover the mysteries of the universe, and we shall unlock the proton, and we'll figure out the origin of life, and we'll see if the stars are alive and make nuclear bombs and whatever. And here we are with cell phones and Zoom and everything else. And we're busy booting up the next phase of evolutionary space, which is intelligence. In some ways, it seems like the next phase of evolution will be pure information. And we're building all of these machines that are focused on wrangling information and organizing information and finding patterns in information so that they can continue to be more effective at the tasks that we have designated as being our tasks for the last 10,000 years since we gave birth to civilization, or whatever you want to call this. And so if the machines are actually really quite good at that, then what does it matter that we don't actually understand how any of it works, as long as the data centers run and the machines do it and they produce the economic wealth for the society, and we're able to.
Lots of animals don't understand how things work, and they get by just fine.
The eagle looks pretty happy as long as there's no DDT.
I mean, I think that so in these societies, right, there are certain things that might be different. For example, could be that how much of the time are you hungry, right? How much of the time are you afraid for your life because someone might eat you? How much of the time do you have parasites that really annoy you, or you feel really bad? I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly how long it happens. We are in a process where we are trying to reduce it again and again. But then, right, I mean, even the feeling of being happy and the feeling of feeling depressed or bad or all these are evolutionary features. And you can ask, like, oh, over evolutionary time, what's the optimal amount of happiness you should have, right? I mean, if happiness evolved for some purpose, then obviously it didn't evolve for you to be happy all the time. It evolved so that you are, maybe it's some kind of a payoff that allows you to learn what to do. So it means you're not happy all the time, but we are now trying to be happy all the time. So we're kind of like abusing this evolutionary feature that we have to be happy all the time. But it's really good, right? Maybe it's okay to do it. I don't think that we should say, oh, because the optimal amount of happiness is 10% of the time, that really gives you maximum learning. That means that this is the amount of happiness we should try to get to. Or suffering, right? The same with suffering. Probably there's like some optimal amount of suffering. But I don't think that's the amount of suffering we should try to get to.
I like the idea of a world where all of this is so fully established and there's benchmarks for each emotion that one should feel. And so if you don't feel that, because you can have a nutritional tracker to show if you've had enough protein or whatever. And then if you haven't had enough happiness or suffering, you just go into the transcranial magnetic stimulation machine and it just zaps you until you feel it and you've reached optimal health again. I feel like this is a danger also of trying to map this stuff out, right? So if you can make an evolutionary argument for what is optimal based off of some past, then you start trying frantically to cram your own existence into that framework to say, well, okay, if that was optimal in the past, and this is what gives you maximal intelligence, or this is what gives you maximal prosperity, or this is what gives you maximal happiness, then we have to apply all of our effort into producing this. And I feel like that almost never works. It almost always gets contorted and ruined.
I think it's also wrong. I don't think that just because the optimal amount of happiness or the evolutionary amount of happiness is 10%, I don't think that means that's the amount we should have. I think that we are free to choose the amount we want.
Yep.
And so I don't think that we should be constrained by evolution or optimality. But then the question, what should we be constrained by is hard. But I don't think a similar question. I don't think that evolution or optimality should decide morals, for example. I think society needs to somehow do it, but how it needs to do it, I have no idea. I'll turn the light on.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Should I turn the light on here too?
Is this better?
I think it's actually worse. I liked the lighting a lot with it off.
Oh, okay.
It was a little mysterious.
Do you want to make a mark here?
Mm-hmm.
It's sunset here. I can do that.
Yeah, we're losing our light too. I mean, I think we do need an orientation for sure. I doubt that it's happiness or anything like that. Happiness, like you said, is not a sustainable situation. You can satisfy your needs, but that doesn't seem to last. Like, humans are notorious. They never have enough money. They never have enough attention. They never have enough love. Like, there's never a situation where people are satisfied at achieving some threshold of positive emotions. It's just like, you're always going to be motivated to pick some challenge and conquer it. And that's really the only orientation you can have, is towards something difficult that's productive for you and your fellow, clan, you're the people you care about, and the world that you want to see happen. And that's not a very happy situation necessarily, but it is meaningful. And so
it's interesting, like right, so some happiness comes from eating candy, right, or playing a computer game, or I don't know what, and that seems to be like to give you this temporary happiness. But then there's also happiness that seems to come and seem to be more long-term, right, out of, say, helping others. And in a way, we're lucky, right, that we have happiness that comes from there, because that seems to be more constructive for society. Like the fact that it seems the way, I mean, we evolved or were taught by our mothers to be happy, to get happiness from helping others. It seems like some ways we're built help us be what's it called, a healthy society in a way.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the same as happiness. It's like when you help people or you do something difficult, it's like a satisfaction. It's a sense of purpose and integration and a sense of well-being, but it's not the same as just, having you got that same dopamine kick of like, wee, this is happy, I feel great. It's like, I don't think it's like that. It's more of it is definitely a more lasting situation. It's a more of your place in the universe. It's more cosmic.
Maybe it's fulfillment. But I think there are some what's it called, studies or papers that claimed that helping others is the thing that provides most happiness in the way that they defined it. I don't know, maybe they looked at more long-term happiness. I'm not sure.
It's a tricky word. Just like every word we pulled out today.
Seriously, I think that this is perhaps the crux, which is that trying to understand life has a biochemical and physical aspect of it. And we can figure out perhaps the place where something that is not alive becomes alive. But when we do that, we have just begun to scratch the surface of what it really means to understand life. And this is perhaps one of the most frustrating things for me, because when I was young and I went into biology, I had taken biology in high school and then I decided to study it in college. And all along the way, I had this faint but persistent hope that at some point it would be possible to wrap my head around the entire conception of life from tip to tail, to understand what is alive, to understand what is not alive, to understand the purpose of life, what it means to have a good life. And biology is rarely that. Biology is more this question of how do the molecules bump up against one another in order to produce the vast display of things that we see. And so it lends itself to this perpetual contemplation, because there's always the hope that by understanding the way that the molecules bump into each other, we can learn some deep and lasting truth that can reflect upon us and help us along the way. And I don't know that we've hit that point, but I have gotten a little bit farther along the line of contemplating it and seeing the grand sweep of the universe as being a delicate evolutionary process that has led to all of this. And so I appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, I think really that by separating a life from life and trying to understand life makes what you described a bit easier. So by trying not concentrating on a life, but instead just on life, I just want to understand the origin of life and how life emerges and what the first processes are. I feel more that I understand what life is, but it's the lower level of life, right? So it's life, then alive, and then the life as a human, that's a totally different level. But the first level, I feel like I understand what better.
What's next for you? What kind of problems are you tackling in the future?
So I have to finish the work that I described, which is this connection between free energy and functional information, and then the somewhat longer term goal is so it basically has to do with understanding how something like a genome emerges, but at a much lower level. So it's understanding how can less than a genome is a system that can have several states where you say like, okay, I can't code for everything, but I have this state that does this, and that other state that does that, and that third state that does this, and now I can select among them, or something like this. I mean, even in the description, I already give kind of an answer to the question I still don't know. But it has to do with this. So it has to do with, I think that, like I told you, I think that genome and RNA and DNA are very late. And I would like to try to fit in the steps before, way before RNA. How do you get there? So this is the kind of longer term goal. The shorter term goal is just to convince people of this thing that I said, that I think RNA and DNA aren't the basis of how life emerged. Instead, they are very late evolutionary innovations.
It's
Very
fascinating.
cool. Sounds like you have serious work cut out for you. I wish you all luck in the world with solving those problems.
And when you make some progress on this question of how it is possible that DNA and RNA are late and what emerged beforehand, it would be cool to talk to you again, because that was actually something that I meant to ask you during the conversation. And so I'm glad to know that you're thinking about it.
Yes. Yeah, I'll be happy to talk anytime you want again.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to see you and to meet you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll let you go. Have a great rest of your night. I'm trying to make sure you're in the same time zone. I've talked to so many people in different time zones today. Yeah, have a great night. It was really good to meet you, and you've stirred up some interesting thoughts that I need to go and ponder on.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye everybody.